Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be back with everyone. Today we're going to be talking about a topic that doesn't receive a whole lot of attention, and that is adolescents who have been affected by prenatal alcohol exposure. There is a lot of work in young children, school-age children, but as young people move into adolescence and then into early adulthood, not a whole lot of research has been done regarding the impact of prenatal alcohol exposure on their long-term development. As we talk about adolescents with prenatal alcohol exposure, I think we have to review some basic information about the concept of behavioral teratology. The term was first developed by Voorhees back in the 1980s, and there are three basic principles. Number one, the impact of exposure to a foreign agent on the developing central nervous system and behavior is a function of multiple factors. So, what he's saying here is that a foreign agent, such as alcohol, can have an impact on the developing brain and the long term behavior through multiple pathways and can be ameliorated or made worse through multiple factors. Number two, damage to the central nervous system during the prenatal period has effects across the lifespan. And number three, central nervous system injury may result in behavioral impairments rather than physical birth defects. Now, this was a fairly avant-garde view at the time because with the thalidomide epidemic in the 40s and 50s, people, scientists, the general public began to realize that physical changes could occur because of exposure to a teratogen. But the view that teratogenic effects may produce behavioral changes rather than just physical, that was a fairly new perspective. As I have been thinking about this and preparing for this webinar, I began to think about a model for how we might look at long-term outcome of prenatally alcohol exposed children and youth. This slide is a model for neurobehavioral teratology. I've taken it from some early work by Linda Mays. Others have brought their own perspectives to this, but this is the most current version that I've come up with, and I think it gives us a good picture to look at. Now we're going to start at the top, the blue square, the prenatal substance exposure, in this case alcohol. And we have to acknowledge that there are other prenatal exposures, including things such as lead, that the fetus may be exposed to. And all the while, we know that maternal psychopathology during pregnancy, education, prenatal care, stress, those factors also affect fetal development. So these three components, other prenatal exposures, alcohol exposure, and maternal well-being, impact the prenatal central nervous system development. And it is that prenatal development that gives us the basic picture for postnatal brain development. During infancy, many factors can affect the development of the central nervous system, such as postnatal toxic exposures. Is there tobacco smoking in the home? Is there methamphetamine use? Is there lead in the environment? Another area is caregiver functioning and interactions. Is the caregiver able to give the infant the kind of input and nurturing care that the infant needs? And the third, and this is often overlooked, is infant function and interaction. This is especially important for prenatally exposed infants. Has the infant been affected neurobehaviorally in such a way that the infant is not able to read the cues and the input of the caregiver, and in that way give back to the caregiver what is needed to set up a reciprocal relationship between infant and caregiver? So all of these factors come together to impact postnatal brain development. And when we're looking to long-term is developmental competency. And for substance-exposed infants and children, developmental competency is most likely affected through neurocognitive functioning, self-regulation, and adaptive behaviors. Now, those areas break down into what we see as attention and executive functioning, behavior of the child, cognitive and language development, and motor development. And these are the factors that ultimately feed into adult competency. And we measure competency for the growing young person and for adults in looking at academic success, social functioning, and assessing risk for psychopathology and substance abuse. So you can see this pathway serves as a model for neurobehavioral teratology. And that's the perspective we have to take when we discuss adolescence with prenatal alcohol exposure. Now, as way of review, let's just go through fetal alcohol spectrum. We know that if a child is prenatally exposed to alcohol, has growth impairment, that is height and or weight below 10th percentile, facial malformations consisting of a thin upper lip, flat elongated philtrum, and short palpebral fissures, and has neurodevelopmental difficulties in 3 domains of functioning, then that child or youth will meet criteria for fetal alcohol syndrome. However, we also know that the great majority of individuals exposed prenatally to alcohol do not have fetal alcohol syndrome. They can, in fact, have no physical anomalies at all, or they can have the facial malformations with normal growth. In that instance, if there's confirmed prenatal alcohol exposure, there are the facial malformations, and there are the neurodevelopmental disorders, then that individual is said to have partial FAS or FAS with normal growth. And finally, ARND is when the individual has confirmed prenatal alcohol exposure, has the neurodevelopmental difficulties, but normal growth and normal facial features. That is ARND, alcohol-related neurodevelopmental disorder. Now, this is all review from previous webinars, and I would encourage you to go back and review these factors because it becomes important as we look at the children long term. Now, what has happened over the years is that the terminology has varied quite a bit. And about 10 years or so ago, the term fetal alcohol spectrum disorders was created. And fetal alcohol spectrum disorders looks at all children, all youth, all individuals that have any manifestation of prenatal alcohol exposure. FASD, as it is termed, is not a diagnostic term, but is an umbrella term that encompasses all aspects of prenatal alcohol exposure effects. Now, relatively recently, in October 2013, the DSM-5, for the first time, included alcohol manifestations in its book. Now, unfortunately, the term they use, neurodevelopmental disorder with prenatal alcohol exposure, or NDPAE, is included in the appendix as a diagnosis or a clinical condition needing further study. So it is not a codable entity in and of itself. However, within the DSM-5, under other neurodevelopmental disorders, they use neurodevelopmental disorder associated with prenatal alcohol exposure as an example under other specified neurodevelopmental disorders, coded 315.8. So for the first time, there is a mental health diagnostic code for individuals who've been affected by prenatal alcohol exposure. And they must meet the criteria for neurodevelopmental disorder and confirm prenatal alcohol exposure that we talked about previously. Many of you will recognize this young lady as having the facial features of a child with fetal alcohol syndrome. You can see the short palpebral fissures, the flat philtrum, and the thin upper lip. Here's that same young lady at the age of 19. And as you can see here, the features do not go away. Here is another young lady who in this picture is 18 years of age, who also meets criteria for the facial features of fetal alcohol syndrome. Now, again, we're not going to review everything about prenatal alcohol exposure and the manifestations, but we're going to focus on the neurodevelopmental difficulties because that is the important aspect when it comes to understanding adolescence. In order to do this, I'm going to review our concept of information processing. Those of you who have been with us before on previous webinars will remember that when we talk about information processing, what we're talking about is the way an individual takes in information into the brain and uses it. And there are 4 steps: input, integration, memory, and output. Input is the way an individual brings sensory information into the brain, whether it's visual, whether it's taste, touch, smell, whether it's auditory. Integration is the way the brain brings that information together. Memory is the way the information is stored in the back of the brain. And output is the way that information is used to produce your response to the sensory information. The thing to remember is that information enters the brain through multiple different pathways. Visual information enters the brain through the eye, travels along the optic nerve, and inserts on the occipital lobe in what is termed the visual cortex. Taste, touch, and smell enter through the parietal lobe, and auditory information enters the ear, travels along the acoustic nerve, and inserts on the midline of the brain. And the job of the brain is to bring that information together so as to integrate it, and I'm sure all of you have heard of sensory integration, to integrate that information and to move it forward to the prefrontal cortex. The important point in our discussion is that the limbic system, shown here as the substructure of the brain, is the part of the brain that takes a lead in integrating information and transmitting it through the brain to the prefrontal cortex. The limbic system sits in the exact midline of the brain. Alcohol is a midline teratogen, and so the primary target of alcohol in first trimester exposure is the limbic system, and that's where the damage occurs. What this all comes down to is the inability of the individual affected by alcohol exposure to fully and efficiently process information. And from research, we know that this difficulty with information processing results in 3 specific areas of deficits. The first is neurocognitive functioning, and that's memory, executive functioning. The second area is self-regulation, the ability to regulate behavior and emotions in response to environmental stimuli. And the third is adaptive functioning, the ability to adapt skills to the necessities of daily living. As we move to talk about the adolescent, we want to address one key question. Will the child with prenatal alcohol exposure be able to learn from the accumulation of life experiences and change? So first, let's look at normal adolescent development. And of course, a key area of normal adolescent development is the changing body. There are enormous differences in the timing and the progression of puberty, associated with growth spurts, changes in body composition, sexual maturation, changes that affect self-image, mood, and relationships, and importantly, changes in the level of hormones that are associated with increased irritability, impulsivity, depression, aggression, and this is strongest in early adolescence. So you can see, even for a normally developing adolescent, this is a time that can be very confusing and overwhelming. In turn, there's a change in the concept of self. What did the adolescent learn from his or her family? And what did adolescents learn from their environment and social environment? How does that affect how the adolescent feels about himself? And through this process of exploring feelings, adolescents try on a variety of different identities. Now, the family environment provides a foundation from this, but at the same time, there's distancing from the family. And that distancing process is normal. And as the adolescent distances herself from the family, there's an increase in peer influence, searches for autonomy, and looking for intimacy outside of the family, which of course is tied up in sexuality. Overlying all of this, of course, is the changing brain. And through adolescence, the individual is developing higher order cognitive skills, the ability to abstract, the ability to look at things in relative positions, and self reflection. So, through this process, we see a lot of risk taking behavior and sensation seeking in the normally developing adolescent. It's accompanied by here and now thinking, egocentrism, and a feeling of invulnerability. You can see how all of these changes are guided through information processing as the adolescent figures out who he or she is. So now let's look at the adolescent who was prenatally alcohol exposed, going through all of the normal changes we just talked about, but viewing it through a lens of the deficits that alcohol exposed adolescents suffer. The first is in the area of neurocognitive functioning. There's poor abstraction and problems with memory. Self reflection is often impaired, and thinking becomes very black and white. Things are right or wrong, with no in between. There's difficulty delaying gratification, and all of this leads to impaired judgment and an inability to really participate in cause and effect thinking. Consequently, the risk-taking behavior and sensation-seeking that we normally see is enhanced in adolescents with prenatal alcohol exposure, and the exposed adolescent might not even be able to differentiate between safe and unsafe behavior. And in our clinical work, we find that is especially true when it comes to sexual behaviors. This all translates into difficulties also with problems with temporal reasoning and understanding time, budgeting, money, and deadlines. In the area of adaptive functioning, that is, how effectively an individual conforms to life demands in comparison to his or her age group, we find this is a particularly vulnerable area for adolescents with prenatal alcohol exposure. Now, in most normally developed populations, IQ and adaptive behavior are very similar. However, in individuals with fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, there are significant deficits in adaptive behavior even for those individuals that have a perfectly average IQ. In an early study by Streisguth, they studied 295 individuals with fetal alcohol exposure. Now, in this population, the average IQ was 90, which is certainly well within the normal range. But average AQ, or adaptive quotient, was 67. This is known as adaptive mental retardation. This demonstrates the difficulties that individuals with prenatal alcohol exposure are going to have.
Young kids with FASD have a difficult time with adaptive behavior, which refers to how able they are to meet everyday life demands in comparison to their age group. These difficulties with adaptive behavior persist into adolescence and into young adulthood.
The routine is very important because it kind of helps me remember the way things go. Like, I have no good memory, so I didn't have to wake up early this morning, but I still woke up at 6:30 like I do every other morning, because if I were to wake up really late, it would throw me off for the rest of the day, and I'd just be scattered everywhere. I wouldn't remember what order to do things in because time would have moved in faster or slower depending. So routine is very important to us, all of us. The other day I was sitting in the classroom and my mom asked me to look at the clock to see what time she could pick me up for an appointment, and it wasn't a digital clock, and so I was like, I don't know how to read that, so I'm just gonna have to call you back and look at my phone. and see what time it is because I can't read like a regular clock. Things that I struggle with would be time management, memory organization, and things like time passage as well.
First of all, looking at a regular old clock or watch with hands, that's going to be far beyond many of the children and adolescents that we work with. Even with a digital watch or clock, Kara can look at the watch and tell you what time it is, 3:45. But the second level is, does she know actually what that means? That where does 3:45 relate in the time of the day? How long till dinner time if it's 3:45 now?
The prefrontal cortex is damaged because of prenatal alcohol exposure. So thinking in abstract, conceptual, higher order terms continues to be an area of difficulty for teens who have FASD.
The idea of credit cards, loans, I don't think that Kara will ever be able to understand those. I hope I'm wrong, but she has her first bank account right now because she has a job that she's had for about a month. And I took her to the bank to open her first account, and it took about 2 hours. And she put money in the account, and they gave her a debit card. And we talked about how important it was every time she used the debit card to write it down in the check register. We talked about the concept that just because you go into the grocery store right now and buy something with a debit card, it won't come out of this bank account until maybe tomorrow or the next day. So if you go online and look and you don't know what you spent today, you don't know how much money you've got. And she spent $150 in a week, and now there's nothing left in her account. She has 2 paychecks that she hasn't deposited yet. We're in the car together a lot, and I have told her, I will take you to the bank to deposit those checks. But you have to bring the checks with you, and when we're out, you have to tell me, Mom, I want to go to the bank, and I'll take you. Because I've got to slowly put the responsibility for these life skills onto her. And so we've been driving around for a couple of weeks now with checks that have not been deposited, so there's no money in her account.
The concept of money and the concept of credit, the concept of a debit card where you can't actually physically see the money but it's out there, or a checking account where your money exists but you might not have the skills necessary to understand when and how much money you can take out at any given point in time. All of those concepts are really abstract. And kids who have FASD, even when they hit young adulthood, have a difficult time understanding concepts that are that abstract.
It could very well be that I just don't understand the concept of like how much I have and how to divide it amongst everything I want to do evenly and not spend it all on one activity or something like that.
She's 19, and we've got to get this money thing down. Let's do our budget first. Is that a good idea? Every month, at the beginning of the month, when I get paid, I pull out enough cash to pay the household daily bills. All of that comes out of the bank in $10 bills. And every month, I get a different teller, and they always go, "You want what?" So I bring home this huge stack of $10 bills, and then we have envelopes. And each category of bill that we have has its own envelope. So we talk about how much do we spend on groceries every week, and we go to the grocery store usually once a week, usually on Sunday. Okay, so the first thing we need is groceries. $400. Kara? No, let's let Kara count it. Okay, Kara, can you count out $400?
What Kara's mom has done for her is to make the process of bill paying and budgeting extremely concrete. She's continuing to provide that external support and external assistance and teaching her this is how each month we budget for our necessary expenses. And she's broken it down into very small steps that are super clear with $10 bill increments because she knows that her kids can handle the $10 bill increments. It's a wonderful strategy.
So Kara, how much money do we need for the car? How much money do I need for gas for the month?
Is that $225 $225?
$125 for gas because I drive a lot. Every month it's a new exercise for them because they don't remember from last month what it was. So then I have, especially Kara, Emma participates a little bit, but I have Kara count out all of the money for the groceries, for the dog food, for the dog kennel, just to start understanding that we can't spend all the money that we have. I don't know if it's really going to sink in for them, but I have to try. And it seemed like that was a way to make it as concrete as possible. They can see the money, they can feel the money, they can understand the concept of 10. And when we go to the grocery store, Kara has to take the envelope with the grocery money, and she has to figure out how many $10 bills does she need to pull out. And then the change has to go back in that envelope.
The third area, self-regulation. And within this area, one of the greatest difficulties we find with the adolescents is deficits in sensory processing. Now, sensory processing comes in several varieties. The first is those individuals who have sensory deficits with decreased sensory capabilities. So they need overstimulation in order to even feel something. So those are the individuals who need deep touch in order to really process tactile information. There are those who are very easily sensory overloaded. That is, they are very sensitive to sensory input. And so a ticking of a clock on a wall, the hum of fluorescent lights can overstimulate that individual. And then there are those folks who have mixed sensory deficits. So they are both hypo and hypersensitive, especially in those individuals with mixed sensory deficits and who need extra stimulation in order to feel sensory information. We see a lot of sexual acting out. Because if you're sensory depleted and you need sensory input as an adolescent, what better sensory input can you get than sexual interactions? And so we see sexual acting out, inappropriate sexuality, and excessive masturbation in many of these young people. And it's a fine balance for caregivers and parents to guide an adolescent through this period of time, to understand that, for example, masturbation is normal, but at the same time must occur within an appropriate environment. Self-regulation difficulties also affect emotional regulation. And of course, when you have emotional dysregulation, you get into behavior problems and difficulties with social interactions. Young people and adolescents with prenatal alcohol exposure are not antisocial. They want friends, but they have difficulty interpreting social stimuli so that they don't quite know what is meant by certain facial expressions. They have difficulty reading body language and knowing how to follow social cues. These difficulties lead their peers to see prenatally alcohol exposed adolescents as overly aggressive, clueless, immature, so that many of these young people have very few friends. So what it comes down to is the adolescent with prenatal alcohol exposure, as social relationships increase in complexity, the alcohol-exposed child has more and more difficulties learning social conventions and applying them appropriately. At the same time, going through the normal adolescent process of trying on different identities. And this, of course, affects feelings about self. And we see high rates of depression, low self-esteem, and anxiety.
It's hard to make friends because we have trouble making them, I guess, and keeping them, I guess.
Who's we that you're talking about?
My sister and I.
Yeah. Why do you think that is?
Because I guess it's easier for other people who don't have AD, FAS, to make them, and then us, it's a little harder to get to know people.
I had a really close-knit group in band, and then as I started hanging out with him, I just sort of distanced myself away from them and I kind of lost my place in the group, and I'm just more of the oddball out now. Most of my friends, they are ADHD, and they're not really like true friends, but they're just friends I like to hang out with at school and walk around school with. I think I just more want to focus on schoolwork and don't really want to bother with my friendships, I guess.
Every parent wants their kids to have friends, and it just hurts a little to know that they don't. But I really don't think Brittany and Allison realize that, and that is a good thing. Allison probably has more acquaintances, friends at school than Brittany did, but I was just glad as long as Brittany had at least one person to eat lunch with. But yeah, it hurts me not to have them after school, have people calling, inviting them places. But again, they didn't sit around and go, oh my gosh, everyone else has friends that they can do things with, we don't. Maybe they thought that, but they didn't verbalize it to me. So I think they're clueless in some of that aspect, which I would think would be part of the fetal alcohol. So that's a good thing.
I think school is kind of my social network. I don't really have a social network outside of school like most people do.
She's never had a really close group of social friends. She's had one or two close friends, but never a big group. And that's one of the reasons I've always kept my daughters really busy is to sort of make up for that absence so that they don't have time to sit around the house and think, oh, all my friends are here or everyone's going to a party and I didn't get invited.
When you have low self-esteem and when you are depressed and when you have difficulty understanding right and wrong, you of course get into difficulties with decision making. Now, in young children, decision making is looked at from a perspective of pre-conventional reasoning. So young children, when they make decisions, those decisions are always within the context of self-interest. And they learn about reward and punishment, and through that begin to differentiate right and wrong. Now, as a young person matures and enters the adolescent years, they get into more adult type of conventional reasoning, and they focus on trying to impress peers. Reasoning becomes hypothetical. They begin to look how their behavior will be perceived by others, and so that hypothetical reasoning and considering how others will perceive them lead their decision-making process. And in teens, there's an emphasis on fairness and on loyalty. Now, the adolescent with prenatal alcohol exposure never moves beyond pre-conventional reasoning. So there is an emphasis on right versus wrong, but it's a very clear demarcation. And everything is all right or everything is all wrong. And so the individual is not able to reflect on a choice before him or her. And because of that lack of reflection, there is a lack of being motivated to make any change in behavior. It is seen by many people as a lack of remorse, so that the individual doesn't feel sorry for what he's done. But what it really is a lack of perspective, a lack of all the possible choices that could have been made, and a lack of generalizability, so that lessons you learn from one situation can be applied to a second situation. Of course, as the individual with FASD grows older, that individual must move into the workplace. And if you think about difficulties with neurocognitive functioning, self-regulation, adaptive functioning, what you end up with is an individual who's going to have very hard time in the workplace. Following a daily schedule, simply getting to work on time is a significant issue. For example, if one of you have to be at work at 9, how do you go through that process? Well, you back up the time. You say, okay, it's going to take me 30 minutes to drive to work. I need 30 minutes to shower ahead of time, another 30 minutes to eat breakfast. So I'm going to set my alarm for 7:30. That's called executive functioning. It's a form of neurocognitive functioning. And what you've done is you've used information to develop and plan the completion of a task. But if you have deficits in executive functioning and can't plan and complete a task, you're not going to show up for work on time. So, what this individual needs help with is not only saying you have to be at work at 9, but somebody will have to sit down with the young person with FASD and work through that process of what time they need to set their alarm, what time they need to be dressed, what time they need to have breakfast. And so you map out that process. Once the individual gets to work, work is full of project timelines, whether it's something very short term or long term. And timelines are pretty abstract, and directions can also be very abstract with unclear expectations. So that the boss working with an individual with FASD has to be very specific as to what's expected each step of the way. An individual with FASD is highly distractible and so needs help staying on task. But often, in many workplaces, there's a lack of oversight.
Well, I was doing dietary aid, and then she felt like I wasn't getting stuff done on time, and like things weren't like I wasn't taking off dirty like linens, and then so she like thought it was easier for me to do dishes back there. I basically do the dish room, basically like dishes and what you saw me doing and stuff. The stock room, and sometimes I help prep, like cut food for them and stuff.
When Brittany first started at the nursing home, it was part-time after school, like 3:30 to 7:30 in the dinner shift. Then when she graduated, we let them know that Brittany was available other hours. Like, oh, great. So they put her on this 6:30 to 3 breakfast and lunch shift. She started as a dietary aide, and she was serving people, cleaning tables, things like that. And all of a sudden, her hours got changed, and I ended up calling and talking to her supervisor, and she said she wasn't doing the job that she was supposed to. And it turns out some of the things were like the tablecloths were dirty, and she was resetting the table and not doing them. So she didn't realize the tablecloth is dirty, I need to change it. But before this person knew that Brittany had some issues and concerns, she just thought Brittany was being a teenager, not doing her job, and I think she was getting close to letting her go.
The supervisor realized after she was told that Brittany has this issue, fetal alcohol, that she said, oh, I can see, I wasn't sure whether she was lazy or whether she just didn't understand.
She's supposed to have this job on her own. I'm not going to go into a job that she has and say, oh, by the way, my child has these issues, please make accommodations for her. So it worked out. It worked out fine, but it just scares me, you know, for Brittany, what other type of jobs she can do and how she'll do.
So the parents stepped in and talked to the supervisor. Brittany was not fired, but she was given specialized job training and has very specific oversight through her job and has been successfully employed for several months now. So this is what it has taken. But it does happen if the family can provide the workplace with the information that's needed. The other issue is just managing the money once the young person is paid. I have a very good example of that. We have a young man who lives in a state in the midsection of the country, which there are no lakes or rivers anywhere near where he lives. Now, this young man is in his early 40s, has already served time in jail, and is really trying to make a go of his life. He was diagnosed with ARND several years ago. His adoptive family, who has been raising him since he was an infant, have been very good at giving him very clear directions and helping guide his development, but they live hundreds of miles away. Through hard work, the family was able to get this young man on SSI. And the father worked for several months with the young man in explaining to him what he was going to do with the money once he got his first SSI check. So the young man did, in fact, receive his check, and at 3 o'clock in the morning called his father. His father answered the phone and said, "Do you know it's 3 o'clock in the morning?" And the young man said, "Oh, yes, I know that, but I'm so excited I got my first SSI check today." And the father said, "That's terrific. Did you do what we talked about? Put some money in the bank, put some money aside?" And the young man said, "Oh no, I bought a wave runner." Now this young man lives in an area of the country that has no water anywhere nearby. It has no lakes, but he used his first SSI check to buy a wave runner. This is the difficulties we get into on a daily basis when working with young people who have FASD. Unfortunately, another context in which we meet many young people with prenatal alcohol exposure is within the context of the courts. Our webinar last year on prenatal alcohol exposure as a mitigating factor in criminal adjudication and sentencing is one in which we go into this topic much more fully. But in summary, young people with prenatal alcohol exposure in the criminal context have no exit strategy. I had an example, a young man who broke into a house to steal a loaf of bread. Now, he easily could have escaped because the family was not home for several hours. But when the family did come home, the young man was still sitting there eating the loaf of bread. The young people waive their rights against self-incrimination right away, usually because they see themselves as wanting to please the police that have arrested them. Their frank confessions, as one young man told me, he told the police exactly what they wanted to hear, because he was looking for social approval. There's no apparent guilt or remorse, which angers the court even more. And there is an inability to really appreciate the magnitude of the crime. And so in court, the young person will appear nonchalant with inappropriate smiling. Now, these behaviors are read in court as someone who really doesn't care and as someone who will just go out and commit further crimes. So where does that leave us? We have caregivers who are working with teens who have prenatal alcohol exposure, and they have few places to turn for help. And so as we work with these young people, we have to consider the caregivers also. We're going to talk about the top 10 list for caregivers who are working with teens who have prenatal alcohol exposure. Number 1, reframe and remind. Remember that the behaviors we see are not willful, but they are caused by the damage to the brain due to prenatal alcohol exposure. And when children are young, we say repeat, repeat, repeat. And it does not change once the young person is an adolescent or young adult. You have to repeat everything until the young person gets it. Number 2, you have to continue to be the external brain. Individuals with prenatal alcohol exposure require coaching and mentoring by a caregiver or parent who really understands prenatal alcohol exposure. The environment has to continue to be supervised and structured very closely. And it's this balance between holding on and letting go. And that's perhaps the hardest part of parenting, even in the best of circumstances. You have to teach independent living skills as the child or young person continues to be dependent on you. Advocating for funding on the larger level, providing continued loving, caring, and nurturing with empathy for trauma and loss, and integrating the external and the internal worlds for the young person. This is what it means to be an external brain. Number 3, the classroom has to be a classroom that understands this concept of external brain. Within higher education, high school, university, There have to be opportunities to develop self-awareness of behavioral triggers. And reasonable accommodations are going to be required all the way through university level. In middle school, there have to be plans for the difficulties with changing classes, because that's basically the time that young people learn to transition from one class to another, moving literally in the hallways between one class and another. That is a very difficult process for a young person affected by alcohol exposure. It's going to take literacy and achievement beyond simply obtaining a diploma. The young person, including all the way through university level, is going to need breaks and soothing activities with flexible scheduling and opportunities for application and practice of everything that young person is learning. Now, there are universities across the nation that provide special education services to young people, so that if you have a young person with prenatal alcohol exposure who wants to go for higher education, one of the first places to look that I would suggest is your local community college. Give the young person a couple of years in community college to get used to university life, and talk with that college before you enroll the young person to make sure that they can address the special education needs in general. It's going to be rare that you'll find a university that says they address the specific needs of prenatally alcohol exposed individuals, but there are schools that do have good special education systems within the university. As a child gets older, whether that individual goes to college or not, he's going to need to start looking at careers. And that's where, again, community college really comes into play, because many community colleges have work-study options, and they can place children and young people into sites where they can be trained in vivo. Remember that you're going to have to focus on job starts. It's unlikely that a young person truly affected by prenatal alcohol exposure is going to be able to keep a job over the long term. But the ability to look for and get a job is of primary importance. And through all this, the young person is going to have to learn stress management methods if he or she is going to succeed. Number 5, prevention versus intervention. You have to be proactive in working with adolescents and young people. Try to identify the triggers and causes of overstimulation, and then teach those triggers to the individual. Break tasks down into smaller steps and teach your young person to do the same. Look for cues when the teen is beginning to feel overwhelmed, and don't wait for the child to get overwhelmed. Use your intervention strategies before the child becomes overwhelmed. Once the teen becomes overwhelmed, it's too late, and you're going to have to wait until she's calm and in control before you can really step in. Don't discuss misbehavior in the heat of the moment, but wait until the young person is calm. Number 6, realize that sensory strategies are going to have to be used throughout the individual's lifespan. Adjust the environment and decrease stimulation when necessary. Allow for opportunities for sensory input. Fidget toys, such as a ball to squeeze, chewing gum. Those are socially accepted methods of sensory input that does provide self-calming. Use frequent breaks with motor movement, and provide a quiet, safe place for times of dysregulation. Help the teen learn to recognize the cues when he or she is beginning to feel like he's falling apart, and then find a place to retreat with beanbags, soft lighting, music, whatever it takes to help the young person self-calm. Number 7, use place. Now, this comes from the world of the attachment therapy. Dan Hughes, a well-known therapist in the field of attachment, talks about playful, loving, accepting, curious, and empathic interventions. And even as the young person grows older into young adulthood, that concept of place is going to continue to be important. and you have to parent to the child's developmental age.
He took a liking to me and took me out for lunch, and then we went. And then like that same week I took him to prom because prom was that week and I didn't have a date. And so I took him. And then that following Monday he asked me out, and so then we started going out.
I have a 19-year-old daughter in the body of a 19-year-old young woman who is absolutely beautiful. And she has the emotional and the developmental characteristics of a 14-year-old. So I've got a 19-year-old body with a 14-year-old brain. And that scares me so much. Because she is smart and because she's well-read and she's articulate, she is attracted to and attracts other typical, intelligent young men. And I don't trust a typical 19-year-old boy at all with my beautiful, tiny little daughter. She's not very happy. Well, you know, he likes my daughter and she's beautiful and she's vulnerable. And I told him that I liked him and I expected him to be a respectful gentleman with my precious daughter. And she wasn't very pleased. I remind her regularly of what my expectations are. When a new young man comes to take her out, I meet him and I remind him of what my expectations are, much to her dismay. And I just have to keep reminding her of how important it is to make good decisions and to make safe decisions.
And I like him. I do too. That makes two of us, except you're not allowed to date him. So.
I don't want to date him, but I want to trust him.
Mom.
What?
I want some chips and sauce.
I don't have the confidence that she would know when she was in a compromising situation. And so it's just going to take a lot of concentrated effort, I think, to get her past all of this.
And so you have to re-examine expectations and be very clear in your expectations, especially when it comes to sexuality. Number 9, provide strategies for down-regulation. And in the early teens, this is a good time to have the young person involved in the martial arts. Taekwondo is great. Music, drumming, rhythmic dancing, massage therapy, those are all strategies for down regulation. And number 10, practice self-care and compassion. Caregivers who are raising young people with FASD have to take time for themselves. And whatever activity helps the caregiver self-soothe and calm down, the person needs to find something that will help them. It's a tough job and it's a tough road with a never seeming end. But we've seen many successful outcomes with our young people with FASD. And over time, I think that most young people can be helped in one way or another. Now, I've referred several times to our film Moment to Moment. That will be coming out this fall. It's the story of 4 teens who have varying levels of deficits due to prenatal alcohol exposure. One of the young people has been institutionalized at times. Another is working on her college degree. And another is in the workplace. But their families have worked very closely with them, and they tell the story of raising teens with FASD and the challenges and the successes. The film, I think, is going to make a significant contribution to helping the general public learn about and understand FASD and help guide professionals in supporting and caring for these young people. So I encourage you to keep an eye on our website. We will announce when the film is available, and we look forward to sharing that with you. Thank you for joining us today, and I hope that this information has been helpful.